Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today we have another lesson from cEDH. cEDH is a metagame within the Commander format that sits at one extreme, with highly consistent, highly efficient decks. Not all cards are equally powerful in all formats, or even in all metagames, but there are lessons to be learned from how players are using some of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. And, of course, Gemstone Mine is part of the Commander Cookout Media Group. If you are enjoying this or any of our other episodes, be sure to check out all of the offerings here on CCO Media Group. You have the original Commander Cookout, not one, but two different gameplay series, between Sidewalk Slam and Curbside Pickup, as well as Commander History with Mac and Ryan, and of course, you've got CAD Pop, Ryan's solo project. All of this and more is brought to you by FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. And with the deluge of new sets coming out this year, personally, I'm most excited for the Spider-Man set. That is way up there, but I'm also kind of here for a space opera set. I can use the promo codes that are on the screen right now and in the description of the episode in order to save some extra money on the cards I was going to buy anyway. That's FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. So today, I want to try to discuss how shifts in the metagame affect how a card is evaluated. And the card I want to look at specifically is one that you're probably familiar with if you've got some familiarity with cEDH. And that card is Thrasios, Triton Hero. A blue and a green, a Simic commander with partner, a 1/3 legendary creature merfolk wizard with 4. Scry 1, then reveal the top card of your library. If you reveal a land, you can put it into play tapped, and if you don't, you can draw that card. Thrasios offers a lot of attractive options, which we've talked about a lot recently, including a mana sink as well as being an infinite mana outlet. Be sure to check out our previous episode about mana sinks for more information on that. In addition, going even further back to the old channel, Thrasios blocks Tymna. It also serves to turn on a lot of those if you control a commander or if you control a legend cards. Cards like Fierce Guardianship or Mox Amber both turn on very easily with Thrasios, and it's not very hard to develop Thrasios on turn 1, or to develop him later on and still have mana held up to do other things or to interact. So why was Thrasios always so good? Ever since the release of Partners in Commander 2016, we had a lot of people trying to use Tymna, and Tymna wanted dorks. So she wanted access to green. Dorks could both provide the mana in order to cast your spells, such as Tymna, as well as, if not needed for mana, you could turn them sideways and attack to draw extra cards off of Tymna. But the combination of green, blue, white, black specifically were the cards you needed in order to play a Flash Hulk deck in the initial iterations. This, using Thrasios, would enable you to hold up mana to interact and lateral into a mana sink if you didn't have another opponent go for it, or if you didn't have to spend interaction, or if you didn't see an opening to go for it yourself. This played great into the Flash Hulk metagame where everyone was trying to win on top of everybody else, and there was a whole lot of stalemates. Infinite mana combos during this era and before were pretty reasonable to set up while holding up interaction and drawing into more action. This provided everything you needed, and in addition, it allowed you to, in the post-Flash ban metagame, still be very competitive by being able to play around the Premier Stacks effect rule of law. Being a mana sink when only one spell a turn was playable was pretty good all around. So, if Thrasios had all these things going for it, why did Thrasios seem to fall off of a cliff in terms of cEDH popularity? Well, it has less to do with Thrasios becoming a bad card, and more to do with the metagame kind of changing around Thrasios, resulting in an entirely different meta to play into, which necessarily changed the way Thrasios could be valued. For one thing, green's weaknesses were magnified manyfold by red's meteoric rise. Dorks had a lot of problems, the biggest one being they were summoning sick, which meant that you could not tap them for mana on the turn you played them. Put a pin in that, we're going to talk about that later on in the episode. On the other hand, red got some really powerful rituals. Jeska's Will, and before that in 2019, Dockside Extortionist. Both of these were explosive and allowed you to win on the same turn that you did your ramping. When you compare the two, it's easy to see why something like Green's Dorks were becoming less and less attractive. The final nail in the coffin for Dorks was the release of Orcish Bowmasters in Lord of the Rings Tales from Middle-earth. X1s were incredibly sad, plus they had summoning sickness, so you had to just hope that your mana dorks survived one trip around the table so that you could untap and actually use them. When you don't have the ability to get value back out of your dorks, it feels terrible and they seem awful. Again, this magnifies Green's weaknesses. Meanwhile, there was a shift in the metagame as the premier stack strategy with Rule of Law style decks became much less feasible in tournament metagames with a timed Swiss round. Lacking a way to close out the game confidently really hurt these decks, and as they fell off, there were fewer decks sitting around a table who wanted the game to go long, where Thrasios really shined. In addition, between 2019 and 2020, we saw the release of multiple powerful rituals, which I just talked about a couple of moments ago. It essentially made 5 into the new 3 in terms of mana value. Not just Dockside, but also cards like Jeweled Lotus made it so both Crom and Tevesh and other 5 mana value partners were extremely viable, almost effortless to cast, in such a way that you could reliably have a turn 1 or turn 2 Tevesh or Crom if needed, and you could immediately start grinding for massive amounts of value. It didn't quite trivialize the cost of these high mana value commanders, but there's a reason why we started calling that Big Boy Winter. In addition, with the release of Theros Beyond Death, we saw the entire metagame shake up with massive shifts to the win-con packages that decks were running. Thassa's Oracle and Underworld Breach both came out of Theros Beyond Death. And by the way, Mac, if you're watching this, make sure when you get to that on Commander History, give me a call. I got some things I got to say about that. The old reliable combos, things like Dramatic Scepter, which Thrasios had often used, or something like Devoted Druid Lines, were really falling out of favor. Dramatic Scepter required 2 dead cards, and in addition, you had to either have a field full of dorks, which you had seen survive without summoning sickness, or you had to feed Dockside with lots and lots of mana rocks, which would let you go mana positive on your Isochron Scepter plus Dramatic Reversal. Devoted Druid Lines also typically needed to get around that whole summoning sickness issue, and during this time we did see the release of Swift Reconfiguration, which would turn our Devoted Druid into a vehicle, which would get around summoning sickness, and get around that whole -1/-1 counters killing the creature thing. This still wasn't redundant enough for players to feel confident in making that a cornerstone of their deck. Again, put a pin in this. We're going to come back to Devoted Druid later. As the metagame shifted, it highlighted Green's weaknesses. The justifications for running Thrasios were getting thinner and thinner, and the color's strength started to boil down to, well, I guess you could tutor for Dockside. Dorks were pressured from the speed aspect, with not being able to be tapped on the turn you cast them, and when they were being also pressured by Orcish Bowmasters just in terms of dying to a stiff breeze. Finally, Thrasios tend to lean into slower win cons. Things like Thassa's Oracle, yeah, the deck could play it, but Underworld Breach was such a powerhouse that you really had to justify why you weren't running red. So what's changed? Why is Thrasios back? Was Simic always bad, or was it always good and we just realized it? Well, decks like Kin and Bonder Prodigy did keep the dream alive, while Thrasios was out to pasture. Kenan remained powerful, and players continued to explore what could be done in the Simic color identity, technology that would then be imported later into Thrasios as players continued to learn and iterate what could be done. In addition, we also saw the release of multiple Flash enablers. We'll talk more about these in detail in a moment, but don't forget, the same set that gave us Orcish Bowmasters also gave us Born Upon a Wind. The big shakeup, though, came at the end of 2024 with the ban list update, which hit turbo decks hard, banning Jeweled Lotus, Mana Crypt, and of course, Dockside Extortionist. The high mana value commanders became a lot less viable. I mean, you see many fewer Croms around the table drawing cards these days. Because the metagame slowed down, Dorks, which still could come down on turn 1, were more likely to be able to untap and then be able to pay you back with mana before an Orcish Bowmasters came down. Usually these were being delayed by a turn to a turn and a half. And every turn that you untapped with your dorks repaid your initial investment. Even better when you have a mana sink in the command zone to dump that mana into. And of course, mid-range games, as the metagame was shifting, becoming slower, definitely favor Thrasios. We also saw two sets at the end of 2024, which really did shift the needle a bit. First, we had Bloomburrow, which gave us two powerful cards in the form of Hazel's Brewmaster and Valley Floodcaller. Hazel's Brewmaster is 3 and a black for a 3/4 creature Squirrel Warlock with Menace, and whenever it enters or attacks, exile up to one target card from a graveyard and create a food token. It also has foods you control have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Hazel's Brewmaster. Remember Devoted Druid? Now you could entomb Devoted Druid or discard Devoted Druid or just let it die to its own ability, have Hazel's Brewmaster enter, exile it, make a food with its ability, and that food virtually has haste because it's just an artifact, it's not a creature. Which also means it immediately combos with that -1/-1 counter untap ability to generate unbounded green mana, which you can then dump into Thrasios to draw your deck and win the game. This was a godsend for Thrasios decks, and Devoted Druid saw an upsurge in popularity. Valley Floodcaller is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 creature otter wizard with flash, and you may cast non-creature spells as though they had flash. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, birds, frogs, otters, and rats you control get +1/+1 till end of turn, untap them. There is, in fact, an unbounded combo where you can use this with a combination of Banishing Knack or Retraction Helix, plus a card like Mox Amber to generate unbounded mana, which you can then use to draw your deck of Thrasios and win the game. All at instant speed, which was pretty nice. However, a lot of the Thrasios decks have moved past trying to use this as a combo piece, and more use it purely as a flash enabler to enable them to win over top of their opponents. In addition, notice that birds are included in that list of cards that get untapped, which meant that Birds of Paradise could be untapped for additional mana and potentially unbounded mana. The release of Duskmourn later that year saw another important card come out for green in the form of Enduring Vitality. 1 green for an enchantment creature, Elk Glimmer, a 3/3 with Vigilance, and creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. That's right, all of your creatures are Birds of Paradise now. In addition, Enduring Vitality has, when Enduring Vitality dies, if it was a creature, returns to the battlefield under its owner's control, it's an enchantment. So essentially, it gets around the Summoning Sickness issue because it gives the power to tap 4 mana to each of your other creatures that's already in play. And if your opponent has to get rid of it, they're going to have to 2-for-1 themselves, destroying first the creature and then the enchantment just to get rid of it. In fact, this ability was found to be so impactful in Keenan lists that a lot of pilots started to wonder if they'd been sleeping on Cryptolith Light the entire time. And it is something that has been revisited, and it's really fascinating. Duskmourn also saw the release of Marvin Murderous Mimic, a 2-mana 2/2 legendary artifact creature toy which has all activated abilities of all creatures with a name different than Marvin's. Not necessarily something that's usually seen in Thrasios lists, but an important part of many green strategies these days as a virtual haste enabler. And as these green strategies became more and more powerful, it meant that games were going longer. Red was on the wane, green was on the rise, and Thrasios was thriving in a metagame where players could expect the game to go long. The next thing to consider, especially in the cEDH metagame, is that in the tournament setting, Thrasios is pretty well positioned to be able to force draws. In tournaments, usually a win is worth 5 points, whereas a draw is worth only 1 point and a loss is worth 0 points. And with everybody using those flash enablers that we've been talking about, a lot of people may try to win on top of each other. And when this happens, someone may propose, look, I have enough interaction to stop one person, but I can't stop 2. Our options are, we all choose to draw, we all get a point, or 3 of us are going to get 0 points and only 1 person will get 5 points. Most of the time, players who are playing to win the tournament are going to take the deal and say that they will accept the draw and the 1 point if it means they're going to be that much closer to still hitting their win and in to the top 16. Tournament players want to win the tournament, and Thrasios decks are pretty well positioned to be able to dictate the flow of the game and force draws. So where did Thrasios go? Thrasios never really went away. The metagame simply shifted away from one that benefited him so much. Thrasios is always where he's been, grinding away in the mid-game. When you're working on your own decks, whether you're brewing something new or updating an old favorite, think about where in your metagame this deck fits. What are the new commanders and new strategies that are present in the metagame which weren't there in the past? And how does your deck match up against those strategies? Are there any clunky pieces of interaction that you could replace with something more versatile? Or are your win cons a little bit too slow and too long in the tooth, and you're going to need to find something stronger to actually close out games consistently? To go back to our brackets discussion from a few weeks ago again, were your previous ratings of 7 out of 10s on your decks really closer to bracket 2 in practice? Remember, bracket 3 is going to anticipate 3 game changers per deck and tons of tutors. So if you're missing those things and you want to play into bracket 3, you might want to up what's going into your deck. Consider an exercise where you sit down and jot down the other decks that you regularly face in your metagame, whether at your kitchen table or at the local game shop or on a server you enjoy playing on. Look at what the strengths and weaknesses are of those other decks, and look at the tools your deck may be able to pack in order to interact with them and be able to both respect their game plans and overcome them as well. That's how Thrasios made his comeback in cEDH, and that's how you can improve your own decks at any commander table. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, be sure to leave a like, and if you are really enjoying it, subscribe to Commander Cookout Media Group on YouTube. You can also find us at GemstoneMineMTG on Blue Sky, and of course, you can always send us an email, gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.